the best video camera for the money. The Panasonic Lumix GH5 has been my go-to camera for about the past 3 years with everything that I shoot, and it's been fantastic. There are some drawbacks to it, which we'll go over, but let's start with the best things about this camera, what makes it so great for the price point. Now, number one is going to be just the general functionality of this camera. Not only is it simple to use, but it's packed with amazing features like 4K 60, which is essentially 4K 60 frames per second, and then obviously the 1080-120, which is one of the most beautiful things about this camera, and something that a lot of people like in cameras, which is essentially being able to shoot slow-mo that's 5 times slower in camera. And what's great about this camera is that you can play it back in 24 frames per second, aka you can play it back exactly how it's going to look when you export it or have it in a Final Cut Pro or Premiere Pro timeline, which is very, very good. When you're on the field, you can check exactly how buttery smooth that shot looks. Now, what's so important to me about having slow-mo is the ability to get handheld shots. Now, some people use Ronin S's and all these different gimbals, and I have those as well, but something that I really find beauty in is being able to get the most, beautiful handheld shots possible. And what really is great about this camera is the fact that it has in-body stabilization, better known as IBIS. The in-body stabilization is the fact that it gives you the ability to essentially get these amazing shots you wouldn't rather have been able to get had your sensor just been fixed. It's essentially like a gummy worm. This is a very bad example, but it's essentially like a rubber ring around your sensor that is able to absorb movement instead of just being fixed. So that ability really kind of absorbs any impact. And when you pair it with a lens like the 12-35 V2, which is black, you're able to use dual stabilization, which essentially means it's being able to use that IBIS, that's in-body stabilization, with the lens stabilization, the OIS, optical image stabilization, to create this amazing shot. Now, my favorite lens for this camera that isn't the best in low light, but just general favorite lens is the 12-35 V2. Now, this is the V1 right here. I've got the V2 to the side of me. The only difference from the looks is that one is kind of this chrome blue and one is black. So if you notice a price difference in a 12-35 f2.8, that's probably because one is a V1 and one is a V2. And if you're shooting with the GH5, I would heavily recommend not getting this lens, but to get the V2. The only drawbacks from that lens is the fact that it's not the greatest in low light, because this camera, the fact that it's got that gummy worm sensor absorber, better known as in-body stabilization, it has a smaller sensor to compensate for that. You got to be able to, if you look in here, it's a small little guy. You've got to be able to make room for that absorption. So the sensor by default is a micro four thirds, and it is just smaller. Smaller sensor like the micro four thirds essentially just means that there's less natural light being able to be brought in. And considering Panasonic's digital alteration or ISO isn't necessarily the greatest as far as like in-camera noise reduction, which no one really likes that anyways. It's just not the best camera in low light, which is why they came out with the GH5S, which you're watching this on right now, which in my opinion is a great camera on a tripod because it's got a bigger sensor, it's better in low light, and it just produces a slightly better image than the GH5, but it's just not a better camera than the GH5 to me, especially to justify the price difference. So if I had to go on a trip right now, out of all the cameras, even this 1DX right here, I would, and if I was just shooting video, I would probably just take the GH5 and a bunch of batteries and a bunch of SD cards, because it's cheap to run, it's easy to run, it's got dual stabilization, which no other camera like this has that does it this well. And it just, I made some amazing travel videos and just overall, I've shot commercials with this camera and I just love it. It's light, it's easy to move around, it's just great. But going back to the drawbacks of it, aside from it not having very good low light capabilities, coming from that whole idea of having a small sensor, the difference here is that, like I said, you're going to allow less light in. And when you allow less light in, by default, you don't have as much depth of field, which essentially is created by your aperture. So between, you can have an f2.8, but an f2.8 looks different on a micro four thirds small sensor than it does compared to this gigantic Canon 1DX full frame sensor, just because, this has more ability to catch light. The more ability you have to catch light, the creamier, the better, the easier it is to get that amazing depth of field that gives you that cinematic look. Is that a deal breaker for me? I mean, yes and no, depending on what I'm shooting. But I really do think that the Lumix will cover more video area than any other camera on the market. And that will probably upset a lot of people, and that's okay. And I'm going to put all these cameras head to head, the A7 III, which I own, as well as the 1DX, the GH5S, and the GH5. Maybe we'll just, clean it up and just make it the GH5, just because I think that's kind of all you really need to know is what brand you should go with. And I might even throw in the Nikon D850, but having you guys know that I'm making the video on this camera, it's not because it's so cheap, it's just because it's so good. If this camera was $1,000 more, I still would be recommending it as the best value of a camera. It just, to me, it's just amazing. The 4K quality is amazing. It shoots in 10-bit, which I never shoot in because I'm all about making videos kind of efficiently, and that really slows down the editing process, but it's capable of it. It's just amazing. The form factor is great. It takes a full HDMI cable if you want to output your to a monitor, which is fantastic. It's got good audio recording. It's got everything. It's just solid. It's super solid. It's got a lot of great customizable buttons, and it's got pretty decent lens choices. I'm not going to say it's the best in the world, but you guys will see in future videos how I pair this up with the Metabone Speed Booster adapter, which is on the GH5 right now, which is running, or GH5S rather, which is running the Canon 50mm f1.4 to create a pretty good looking image. So take a look at this image, see if you like it, see if you could tell the difference between Canon or Sony color science or not. That's something we'll go over in future videos, but I just kind of wanted to touch on how great of a camera this really is. And who it's for is the person who's trying to get into filmmaking, who wants the most functionality for their money and wants a small form factor that is very, very capable, because anything else to get a better result than this will cost you significantly more money. So the 12-35 lens, which is on here, the V2 version is about $700, and then the body, brand new from Amazon, is about $13.99, I believe, last I checked. So $1,400. So that leaves you with about $2,100 plus some SD cards and maybe some extra batteries. So say you're under this whole camera setup for under $2,500. I'll put all the links in the description below so you guys can check out how this kind of would kit out. But with that being said, guys, I mean, I really don't think you can get a better camera with more functionality for the money. And I know people talk about it, but I just feel like it's almost underhyped for how good it is. I mean, as long as you're not trying to crank the ISO and shooting weddings and in dark areas, and you don't have any light like this right here, you see aperture 120D just shining on me, and the Panasonic cameras have no issues then because you're fixing their major problem. But like I said, if you're really after amazing low light cameras, you're going to want to steer towards the A7 III or the 1DX Mark II as their full frame and just better in low light. Sony is killing it with their low light game right now, and Panasonic is a drawback. And last but not least, something to consider, because a lot of people are getting into vlog or have been in vlogging and are interested in it. This camera, the last drawback of it that I almost forgot to mention was the autofocus. Now, the reason I say that is because the autofocus is so slow, and it gets to the point where it's so annoyingly slow that I would never recommend this for somebody who's trying to vlog unless they make sure they're in focus first. If you're trying to get a run and gun shot and you're just pointing it at you, like this, it just, people can argue with it, but from my experience, it is very slow. They have updated it a little bit in the GH5S, but for the GH5, it's just not the best. If you want a perfect vlogging camera, take after David Dobrik and go for a Canon 80D, but you're not going to be able to get the buttery slow motion that's in here. So if you're trying to go for more of a kind of knockoff Peter McKinnon style of a vlog that has a lot of slow motion, working it, some time-lapse stuff, but you don't want to spend the money for the 1DX2, then grab one of these suckers and just make sure that you are in focus and make sure that you've got some decent light coming in, and you're going to be just fine. You're going to create amazing results with this camera, I can assure you. So that being said, guys, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this Panasonic Lumix GH5. If you guys want to take a look at my company's highlight reel from 2018, feel free to check it out. I'll link it at the end of this video, and stay tuned for future videos. As always, like this video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't. Subscribing would mean the absolute world to me, guys. I'm going to go over a lot more gear reviews and kind of go over all of my tests of spending multiple thousands of dollars over the years figuring out what works best for me, so maybe I can give you the opportunity to see what works best for you. So with that being said, guys, as always, thank you so very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.